Are you curious about how to ensure a joyful and secure retirement? Imagine discovering the secrets to living independently and gracefully in your later years, free from the burdens of relying on your children. In this captivating story, you'll meet a remarkable woman who, after facing the trials of aging and family dynamics, uncovered essential lessons for a fulfilling old age. Her experiences offer invaluable insights into maintaining your dignity, protecting your assets, and finding happiness on your own terms. Dive into her journey and learn how you too can embrace a peaceful and self-sufficient retirement. If children can take care of their parents, it proves that they are successful and capable. One should be proud of staying with their children. Elderly people won't have to worry about food and drink. However, relying entirely on grandchildren often leads to problems. Many cases have shown that relying on children is not ideal. It's best to depend on oneself. A typical example is a 75-year-old woman who suffered from a serious illness 2 years ago. After that experience, she realized the reality of her future life in old age and decided to protect 3 things rather than rely on her children. Why did she feel that relying on her children was useless and ineffective in old age? What should she protect? Let's listen to her story to understand this issue better. She is now 73 years old and has been widowed for 13 years. Before her husband passed away, they had a happy life together. They had 2 sons and 1 daughter, all of whom had good and stable lives, living and working in the city. However, the good times didn't last long. 5 years after retirement, her husband died in a car accident. Since then, she has been living a lonely life in a cold house. Before, she felt that her health was quite good, and with her monthly pension, she could take care of herself, even without her husband. After her husband's death, the person responsible for the accident gave her a settlement of $12,000, along with $8,000 her husband had saved over the years. However, she still didn't feel at ease. The rest of her life was long, and living alone with money felt meaningless. Do you know why she felt so worried? She shared that many elderly people advised her to spend money on eating, traveling, shopping, and hiring a helper, but she felt that this life in old age did not belong to her. She always thought that her children needed support, but only when facing issues did she realize the truth. Her children were all greedy and selfish. After her husband's death, she tried to comfort herself and take care of things cheerfully. Initially, her children agreed that she would stay at each son's house for 5 months, and then at her daughter's house for 2 months. They told her to choose and stay as long as she wanted. After living with her children for some time, she found that this arrangement did not bring her happiness or joy. When her sons and daughter invited her to stay with them, claiming it was to ensure a relaxed old age, in reality, she found it less comfortable than living alone in her old house. Besides being treated like a guest by her son-in-law, when staying with her elder son, she had to endure many complaints. At her elder son's house, her daughter-in-law assigned her many household tasks. Initially, her son gave her $200 per month for family expenses, but after a few months, he started complaining that her pension was too high and asked her to contribute more to household expenses. She agreed because she was accommodating. Later, he started giving her only $80, then nothing at all. She had to take care of everything herself. Likewise, when she moved to her younger son's house, the situation was the same, but her younger son tricked her out of more money than her elder son. After she had just moved in, her younger son asked for $8,000 for an investment project. Since she had spent all her money on living expenses at her elder son's house, she had no more to give. Her younger son, dissatisfied with her lack of money, began insisting that she sell the old house. After all, she only stayed there a few times a year. The sooner it was sold, the better to get a good price. They kept saying that if she had money, she could share it with her siblings, and they would all be richer, making her life better too. Although her late husband had suggested selling the house to live with their sons after retirement, she had no intention of selling it after his death. After all, she and her husband had put in so much effort, sweat, and tears to buy that house. It was the only place they could live. If sold, she wouldn't know where to go for family gatherings. She refused her son's request, but unexpectedly, her younger son and elder son pressured her to sell. She was adamant about not selling. To appease her children, she gave each of them $2,000 and falsely said she only had $8,000 left. This dispelled their intention to sell the house. She thought she could finally live in peace. However, after a serious illness, she saw the reality more clearly. 3 years ago, she suffered from a stroke due to a fall. Fortunately, a passerby took her to the hospital in time. She had to limit her movements, was unable to use her limbs, and could not do many tasks. Therefore, she needed someone else to care for her. Realizing she could no longer help, her children began to disregard her. Even her daughter-in-law and son became increasingly dissatisfied with her, treating her like a burden and constantly complaining about having to serve her. The doctor advised her to rest and take good care of herself for recovery, but living with her son, She was often scolded and criticized. This may have contributed to her ongoing stroke issues later. They wanted to send her to a nursing home, but she had no interest in going there at all. Being in a nursing home felt like being in prison, unable to go anywhere. Therefore, she decided to return to her hometown, hire a helper, and live comfortably. Initially, her children were hesitant and said that living alone didn't need much money, so they agreed to her decision. They were forced to compromise. Less than a year after returning home, her health quickly improved. She could walk, her limbs were more flexible, and she could do some simple household chores. Reflecting on this, she felt that not selling the house and not giving all her savings to her children was the right decision. If she had no house or money now, she would have had to rely on her children daily, enduring their complaints or being in a nursing home. After such a serious illness, she realized that in old age, it's better to protect oneself in these 5 ways rather than rely on children. 1. First, maintain good health. Protecting health throughout life is essential. 2. Second, have personal assets and a pension. One should not depend on children but rely on oneself. 3. Third, keep enough property and money and never give everything to children. 4. Fourth, do not work for children. Instead, travel and relax. 5. Fifth, do not rely on children but work and rely on oneself to have a meaningful and enjoyable life. These principles not only helped her live a happy old age, but also made her children more comfortable. Living with children did not bring happiness. Living alone in her old house allowed her to live her own life. Therefore, if one is still young, it's better to learn and gain experience. If not, living alone in old age is also good. At least one's life has meaning and interest beyond children. In old age, money becomes the power of the elderly. Therefore, if parents have assets, they should use them for themselves and make a will for the rest of the inheritance. It is not advisable to give away your assets to your children while you are still alive. There are cases where parents, before passing away, transfer their house to their children and end up living as tenants in their own home, like in the example here. So, when approaching the final years of life, you need to learn to provide yourself with a fallback plan. Your assets are a means to enjoy your old age. The elderly should not transfer their assets to their children before they pass away. Doing so is akin to proactively making your children's lives easier and placing yourself in a passive position. Wise individuals will only transfer their assets to their children when they are nearing the end of their lives. This not only avoids the risk of the assets being squandered by the children, but also ensures that you have enough to cover retirement services if the children are ungrateful. It is only when the elderly keep their assets that the children will show respect. In families with many children, elderly parents often say they live for their children. They spend their lives supporting their children, leaving nothing behind. In wealthy families, to receive a larger share of the inheritance, some ungrateful children pretend to take care of their parents just to gain benefits. However, deep down, they do not truly want to honor or care for their parents. Therefore, to have a peaceful old age, you should ensure you keep your assets to cover your living expenses after retirement. The second thing is to avoid living with your children to prevent unresolved conflicts. Many elderly people, like a woman who is nearly 70 years old, should be spending their old age peacefully under their children's care. But the reality is harsh. She has 4 sons and 2 daughters. In her youth, she worked diligently to raise her children. However, in her old age, her 4 sons do not want to support her and avoid each other. The 4 sons take turns caring for their mother, but do not want to fully commit even to a single day. There was a day when she was at her eldest son's house and got bitten by a dog, so she had to stay for a few days. However, the family was displeased. She then turned to her second and third son's homes, but each time she was moved around. When staying with her sons, she had to be considerate of their daughters-in-law. Her life was uncomfortable, despite her deep love for her children. The petty jealousy among her children made her even more exhausted. When ill, she had to manage on her own. Her 2 daughters loved their mother very much and have tried many times to bring her home. However, the sons refused, fearing social stigma. As a result, they kept their mother to maintain their reputation. The daughters wanted to care for her but were helpless. At 70, she realized that living with any of her children was not ideal. She was reluctant to enter a retirement home, fearing it would be seen as a sign of ungratefulness. The core issue is her deep-seated pride and reluctance to face this reality. Therefore, after retirement, the elderly should not move in with their children. Although the intention is to help and support them, this could lead to an unsatisfactory outcome. The reality is that living under one roof with different generations can create conflicts due to differing ideas and lifestyles. Maintaining boundaries can sometimes preserve a harmonious relationship instead of straining it within the children's home. After retirement, rather than being appreciated by children, you might end up facing complaints and reproach. Thus, to ensure a peaceful old age, You should only visit your children and help them when necessary. The third point is not to exhaust yourself working for your children. In today's world, many retirees continue to work to earn extra income to support their children or pay off debts. Some parents, after retirement, not only take on additional chores but also manage household tasks for their children. Instead of focusing on personal health and well-being, they overextend themselves. This is a significant mistake. After retirement, it is unreasonable for the elderly to continue working excessively. The most important thing each day is to take good care of oneself. When health is compromised, it not only causes personal distress but also burdens the children. Instead of overworking, the elderly should focus on exercising and maintaining their health. Regardless of how much money is earned, it won't be enough to cover medical expenses if health deteriorates. As we age and become weaker, it does not mean we cannot find happiness. By planning retirement life carefully, we can still enjoy a peaceful old age.
If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time.
Part 2. Old age. Don't make the mistake of living with your children. A short visit can be fun. As you get older, no matter how loving and respectful your children are, it's wise not to live with them. Visiting for a few days is enjoyable, but staying long-term might not be the best idea. Dear friends, many seniors worry about who will take care of them when they are sick or feel lonely and isolated. Because of this fear, some decide to move in with their children. When advised not to live with their children in their later years, they often say, every family has different dynamics and some children are more caring than others, so they choose to live with the most devoted child. But let me tell you, even if your child is incredibly caring, it's still better not to move in with them. A short visit can be fun, but staying too long might turn out to be a mistake. 1. When living together becomes too much. Mrs. D shared, I am a mother who has lived in the countryside all my life, working on the farm with my hands in the dirt. In the past, my husband and I had to stop our education early due to poverty, and we got married young, having 2 children, a boy and a girl. Fortunately, both of them were bright and quick learners. Hoping to give them a better life than ours, my husband and I worked hard to support their education. They didn't let us down. Our son went to university, and our daughter followed in his footsteps. Both excelled in their studies and earned scholarships. After graduation, they easily found good jobs. They moved to the city for work, and with their busy schedules and the excitement of youth, they rarely visited home. My husband and I stayed behind, taking care of ourselves without burdening the kids. During holidays, if they visited, the house was lively, but when they didn't, we didn't mind. Everyone has their own life to live, and as long as they're healthy, happy, and content, that's what matters. When my son got married and my daughter found a husband, we, as parents, felt that we had fulfilled our responsibilities. When my daughter-in-law became pregnant with her first child, she naturally had concerns about the delivery. My son called me saying, Mom, can you come and help out? My wife is due in a few days and I don't know how to care for a new mother. A mother's presence is most comforting during childbirth, and my wife's mother has passed away out of love for my son. I immediately arranged my affairs and took the earliest bus to the city. My son went to work, and my daughter-in-law greeted me without much warmth or coldness. She said, my husband worries too much. Giving birth isn't like it used to be. Nowadays, if you have money, you can hire someone to care for both mother and child at the hospital. He doesn't need to bother you. Since becoming her daughter-in-law, she had only visited the countryside a few times, once when my husband was seriously ill, and another time during the last Lunar New Year. So we never really had the chance to grow close or understand each other. I told her, if taking care of you is a bother, then you don't see me as your mother. She stayed silent and changed the subject. Thankfully, her delivery went smoothly, and my grandson was born healthy and strong. In the first few days after birth, when her wounds were still painful, I helped her as much as I could, even staying up at night when her milk hadn't come in yet. I'm just a simple woman from the countryside living in modern times, not so old-fashioned that I can't adapt. So whenever I cared for the baby, I always asked for her opinion. After all, even though it's my grandchild, she's the one who gave birth to him. I was careful not to cause any friction, knowing that every generation has its way of raising children. A few days later, she started moving around more easily and even took over all the household chores, from cooking to caring for the baby. I told her she needed to rest and take it easy, but she replied, science today isn't like in your day when you had to be so cautious. Too much caution can cause more harm than good. Late one night, I overheard my son and daughter-in-law arguing. Her voice was clearly annoyed. I told you we should hire help, but you wouldn't listen. Instead, you insisted on having your mom come. She's from the countryside, and her way of doing things is so different from mine. I can't stand how she asks me about everything like I'm a child. I'd rather spend money on a maid than rely on her. They continued to argue loudly enough to wake the baby. I wanted to step in but hesitated. That night, I couldn't sleep. I realized that my daughter-in-law didn't want to live with her mother-in-law, even though we hadn't had any conflicts. Or perhaps there were things she wasn't saying but wasn't happy with. If she needed me, I could stay as long as she wanted, but it seemed she didn't. Meanwhile, back home, I'd left my husband alone, having to cook and take care of everything himself. It's easier for a woman to manage alone than a man. Besides, the longer a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law live together, the more likely it is that small issues will become big ones. The next morning, I got up early, packed my things, and made breakfast for them. I noticed my daughter-in-law's eyes were swollen, probably from crying after the argument with my son. My son was eating quietly, not his usual cheerful self, so I said, "I heard you two arguing last night, and it made me very sad. I came here to help, not to cause any discord between you. If you're not comfortable, I'll go back home. To be honest, I don't feel at ease here either. For us older folks, there's no place like home. Besides, there's a lot of work back in the countryside, and your father has a hard time managing alone." My son looked at me and said, "My wife is young and doesn't always speak well. Please don't hold it against her. Stay a little longer until the baby's 1 month old, and then you can go." My daughter-in-law just sat there without saying anything. I gently responded, "I see that she's already recovered and can handle everything herself. If needed, you can always hire help. When the baby's a bit stronger, bring him home to meet his grandfather on the ride home." My phone buzzed with a message from my daughter-in-law. "I'm sorry, Mom, for all the trouble I've caused you. If I've done anything wrong, please forgive me. Once the baby is stronger, we'll bring him to visit you." And Dad reading that message made me feel much better. In-laws and parents should not live together unless necessary. It's better to visit occasionally, and children should bring their kids to visit their grandparents when they have time. Rivers have their own lives, and the sea has its own joys. Everyone should live happily without holding grudges, and that's how happiness is achieved. In Western culture, parents usually only feel responsible for their children until they turn 18. After that, young adults often move out, becoming responsible for their own finances and lives. Many start renting a place or take out a mortgage and gradually pay it off. This gives Western parents time to travel, care for themselves, and enjoy their middle and old age. In contrast, Eastern culture leans towards parents protecting and supporting their children until they are fully grown. Even after children start their own families, parents often continue to feel responsible for them financially and in other ways. In many Asian families, even after reaching retirement age, parents still support their grown children financially and take care of their children-in-law and grandchildren. This can lead to adult children becoming overly dependent on their parents. It's possible to get along with your own children, but will your children-in-law really be harmonious with you? We're not worried about our children being ungrateful, but we do worry about in-laws influencing them and causing conflicts that can't be resolved. It's better to avoid friction by not living together. Once conflicts arise, they're hard to resolve, and in some cases, parents and children or in-laws can't even face each other anymore. So even if your children are good and caring, if you're over 60, it's best to stay at your own home and only visit them for a short time. The longer you stay, the more likely conflicts will arise. We don't want that, do we? 2. The biggest regret of my life. My biggest regret in life is selling our home and moving to the city with my children. This is the heartfelt confession of Mr. N, a 69-year-old man who, along with his wife, sold their house in the countryside to move to the city with their kids. Mr. N and his wife were both middle school teachers back home. They have 2 sons who went to college in the city and decided to stay there for work instead of returning to their hometown. After graduating, their children found stable jobs, but their incomes were just enough to cover the high costs of living in the city. About 10 years ago, when Mr. N and his wife retired, they had saved around $50,000. They decided to keep this money for their children's future. Seeing their sons struggle with expensive and cramped rental homes, Mr. N suggested using their savings to buy a small piece of land in the suburbs, hoping it would give their children a stable place to live instead of renting. They managed to buy a 40-square-meter plot and built a modest house on it. At first, things seemed to go well. Their eldest son got married, and soon after, the second son followed. However, the couple had nothing more to give their children except for the piece of land far from the city center. Neither son wanted to live there because it was too far from their jobs. They considered selling it, but they would have lost half its value. So they kept it, hoping to leave something for their children to inherit. As their grandchildren were born and their children's jobs became unstable, Mr. N and his wife had to help out by looking after the kids. Mr. N took care of one grandchild at his eldest son's house, while his wife looked after the other at their second son's place. Even though they lived in the same city, they only saw each other once a month. The inconvenience of renting and the need to care for their grandchildren led their children to suggest selling the family home in the countryside to move to the city permanently. Since the sons worked in different parts of the city, neither wanted to live with their parents. They sold the family home for $80,000, along with the suburban plot, and split the money between their two sons to help them buy apartments. Each son bought a small apartment, and Mr. N and his wife were happy that their children finally had a stable place to live. But their happiness didn't last long. The couple soon found themselves in the middle of conflicts between their daughters-in-law and between the daughters-in-law and Miss S. With no other choice, Mr. N and his wife ended up living with their eldest son because his 70-square-meter apartment had 2 bedrooms. But living with his children made Mr. N feel cramped and uneasy. Things got worse after his wife passed away. His greatest regret is that his wife, who passed away from lung cancer 4 years ago, didn't get to spend her final days at home. During her last days in the city, despite being close to the hospital, she felt lonely because no family or friends could visit her due to the distance. She often lay facing the wall, wishing she could return to the countryside. Even though relatives back home wanted to visit, they didn't want to disturb the grandchildren, so they only called. In her final days, she had to be hospitalized, and although she longed to go home to spend her remaining time in peace, she feared that her death would burden her children. At that time, she told Mr. N, "If only we had given part of our assets to our children and kept a small piece of land in the countryside, it wouldn't have been this painful." Thinking back to those days, Mr. N feels emotional. He believes that if they had stayed in the countryside, his wife might not have died alone. Now, living with his eldest son, he feels lonely. The grandchildren are busy with school and don't visit much, and his sons are too busy with work to spend time with him. In the evenings, Mr. N often sits in the apartment lobby, thinking about how he might end up like his wife, wishing he could spend his last days with family and friends in their ancestral home. He deeply regrets selling their family home in the countryside to move to the city with his children. Friends, the reality is that many elderly people want to be near their children, and children also want their parents in the city to take care of them more easily. But many heartbreaking stories have occurred because of this. Some think that providing material things is enough to show filial piety to their parents. However, material things are just one part of it. The more important thing is to care for and show love to them. Sometimes, all they need are a few kind words or a simple conversation, but children often forget this.
If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time.